We typically believe that some values need to be enforced through state violence. We do this when we make certain things illegal. Values tell us how we should act. Sometimes, however, they fail to explain why we should act in that way, or they at least fail to get the message across to some people. This necessitates the law. Law gives those values greater authority through the use of violent coercion. It's the only reason to follow such a value because the threat of violence looms menacingly behind it. It's the only reason to follow such a value because power was used to coerce the individual. Does such a value compensate for a lack of rational appeal by inciting state violence against its enemies? Or are some values good in of themselves? If they are good in of themselves, then why do they require law? Either the values are good in of themselves and should be followed, or law amounts to a might makes right style argument. Or perhaps the problem is that people are too stupid to understand that the value is good, meaning the law is required to make that fact a little more obvious to them. They cannot understand why the value is irrationally appealing, so you need to make that just a little bit more obvious by saying that you will throw them in prison if they break with it. This forces them in line and makes living according to the value a more rational act. It is artificial rationality, however. It was constructed around the value, rather than coming from the value, as a real rationality does. Any value can construct artificial rationality around itself, but few exhibit real rationality. Many of the worst values that history has seen were surrounded by artificial rationality, which gave them their authority. What is certain is that such a view requires that many people be looked down upon as predisposed to immorality by their own idiocy and inability to realize the existence of the real rationality. This is a very pessimistic and condescending understanding of humanity and human nature. Are values good for most people but not everyone, necessitating a law to restrain the few? Or are values just random things that make us feel good, which we try to grant violent authority so we can enjoy watching them influence society? If a value is truly good, then we should adhere to it regardless of if it appears in law. If a value is bad, then we shouldn't adhere to it regardless of if it appears in law. Values tell us how we should act. Either some values do that better than others and are therefore better, or all values are just meaningless preferences. Why should we listen to what values tell us about how we should act? Because it is in our interest to align with them? If that is the case, then why is law necessary to cement them? The reason is either that the values are lacking in real authority is appeal to rational self-interest, so they must construct their own authority by infecting political systems, taking them over, and creating an artificial rational incentive. Or alternatively, it could be said that many people are just too stupid to realize what is really good for them. That is once again a far darker understanding of human nature. Perhaps some other ideas could also be offered here. Values tell us how we should act, and a value that we should care about is one that tells us why we, as rational actors, should act in that way. A rational appeal exists before law exists. Is every person who wants to see their values law lacking confidence in either the real authority of their values or in the intelligence of the people to recognize that real authority? Or does law simply represent the realization of our most important values? A kind of ritualistic embrace which states that this is what we stand for, and makes the values that are strong regardless of law just a little bit stronger. Is law simply the manifestation of values that are correct without law in a more respectable framework? If law makes good values more respectable, does law make bad values more respectable? If an evil idea becomes law, does that idea become a little less evil? This is something that is worth thinking about. If we cannot convince people why they should follow our values, then what authority do our values have? If the only authority they have comes from a legal system, then we have embraced might makes right reasoning, and the idea that our values are too weak to have any authority before being defended by state violence. Are good values the values of lawlessness? Values which do not try to infect the law because they know that they are themselves enough? Or is law necessary because some of us are incapable of understanding the appeal of these values and need to be restrained and controlled in more obvious and overt ways? What do you think? I think that good values can be realized by the vast majority, and followed even without the consideration of the law and the penalties that it brings into question. I, for example, value reciprocity. Even though reciprocity is not mandated by law, it is common throughout society. People treat each other how they want to be treated, to uphold a mutually beneficial moral framework which looks out for everyone's interest. This system is in our interest, and it does not need to be mandated by law in order to exist. This is of course not to say that all systems that exist independently of law are perfectly valid and rational. Such an argument would be entirely absurd, given the fact that societies have held contradictory values independently of law. Not everyone selects ideas based on rationality, and it would be a foolish assumption to claim all practitioners of reciprocity are highly rational. Law is necessary to appeal to those who are not rational or who don't have that which ought to be deemed good as an interest. A handful of people will always break with ideal values, and in severe cases, law is necessary to both deal with these people and minimize their numbers by giving values greater and more obvious authority. Law makes sure that it is obviously rational to not break with values. One must be very rational to understand the best values. One does not need to be very rational to realize they shouldn't do something that would likely get them sent to prison. Law should be informed by good values which actually serve us. Law is not a might makes right argument, so much as it is an acknowledgement that some people are irrational. It also acknowledges the disturbing fact that occasionally that which we label evil may be in someone's rational interest. Morality is about how we should act, but it means very little when there is not any rational reason why an individual should act in that way. This is quite a disturbing thing to think about. The idea that perhaps it could be rational for someone to do an evil thing. That is an idea which can be approached in further depth another time. I hope you found my ramblings here somewhat interesting. I would love to hear your thoughts on this interesting topic.